Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Sarah Moriarty. I'm Executive Director of Charleston Literary Festival. We are privileged at our festival to be in a position to bring artists, authors, and interviewers together in lively conversations. And these conversations aim to bridge difference and to deepen our understanding of ourselves and of others and the world around us. And these aims are more important than ever today, and I thank you all for joining us this afternoon. The book at the heart of today's session exemplifies our festival's mission, Marie Arana's Latinoland, a portrait of America's largest and least understood minority, serves as both a historical overview and a cultural commentary, aiming to foster a better understanding of the Latin American experience and its impact on contemporary US society. The book is a vast yet personal overview of Latin America, drawn from hundreds of interviews and rigorous research that explores the multiplicities, nuances, and differing cultural and political backgrounds of those we know as Latin American. To discuss this book and its ideas, Marie Arana will be in conversation today with Bilal Qureshi. Bilal is a broadcaster, essayist, and critic. Bilal's writing and criticism is published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and Newsweek. He's a frequent contributor to NPR's Pop Culture Happy Hour. From 2008 to 2015, Bilal was a producer, editor, and reporter for NPR's All Things Considered. And Bilal and Marie met almost 10 years ago when Bilal interviewed Marie at NPR, and Marie said it was one of the best interviews she's ever had. So no pressure, Bilal. Bilal Qureshi, everybody.
Thank you.
And that brings me to Marie Arana. We're honored to have you here today, Marie Arana, with us. Marie Arana is a Peruvian-American author. She was the inaugural literary director of the Library of Congress. She has received a 2020 Literary Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters and has held prominent roles, including director of the National Book Festival and writer-at-large for the Washington Post, where she was also the editor-in-chief of Book World. Her book, Silver Sword and Stone, Three Crucibles in the Latin American Story, was named Best Nonfiction Book of 2019 by the American Library Association and shortlisted for the 2020 Andrew Carnegie Medal of Excellence. Her biography of Simón Bolívar won the 2014 LA Times Book Prize. Her memoir, American Chica, was a finalist for the 2001 National Book Award. She has published 2 prize-winning novels, Cellophane and Lemanites. Marie is strongly involved with organizations that protect the rights of writers and freedom of expression, like PEN America, the Authors Guild, and the American Writers Museum. She's been a judge for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bilal Qureshi in conversation with Marie Arana.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, welcome, Marie, to Charleston. It's so nice to see you again here.
Oh, Bilal, you know, I was so thrilled when they told me that you were going to be the one interviewing me. Such a wonderful critic and marvelous interviewer, and we've known each other quite a few years now. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to Sarah Moriarty for running the most incredibly thoughtful and diverse festival.
Absolutely.
And Amanda Bagdonas, who is the power behind the curtain. And I'm very glad to be here. This is, I haven't been in Charleston for 10 or 12 years. My brother lives here. So this is a family destination, and it's a shame that I haven't been here. It's just such a wonderful reading culture and artistic community, and I thank you for that.
When you mentioned, sort of noticing how everything works, it's also because of the National Book Festival, which you put together with the Library of Congress for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing I've always really admired about your work across the books, which we have available, it was amazing to see all of them here, mm-hmm. Is that your kind of commitment to literary citizenship and a kind of the different kinds of books that one can write and make, from novels to nonfiction. When I first read about this book, these are these big idea books. You have a history of Latin America through Simón Bolívar, another huge, sweeping history of Latin American the story, and then now this book, which takes on this big question of the Latino community in America. I do have to say that sometimes it feels like those kinds of big nonfiction books almost don't exist anymore. They're sort of, and I would love to ask you a little bit about this form, and when you thought about doing this book, I mean, did it ever feel like too big of a topic to almost take on in one book?
Oh yes. Well, it was an evolution, Bilal, because I started out with a memoir. American Chica was a memoir, so it was a very confined, my own story. I didn't have to go anywhere, maybe talk to a few people, but it was a very personal book. And then with every book that I've done, I've been on a mission. I've really been I've challenged myself, because as I've gone through my career in book publishing and then at the Washington Post as the book's editor and on, I really, Latinos were so invisible. I mean, people never asked us who we were, or if they did, it was like they didn't know that there were others of us here. And so I began this mission of describing who we were, and so that meant where we came from. So 7 books really were on Latin America and Latin American history, Latin America through novels, a whole picture of the world that we had come from. And then I realized that this is the second largest Spanish-speaking nation. It lives in this country, it's second only to Mexico. So it was at that point when my editor said, well, you know, Latin America is here. Why don't you write about people like you, people who are here? And that's really when I decided to write this book. I had no idea. I was dilating from one book, from the story about me, to larger and larger and larger stories. And I got to Silver Sword and Stone, which was a whole history of Latin America and how the problems that are in Latin America today come directly from history, and trying to track that. And I thought that was a big project, but this was just huge. I mean, when you think about the Latino population, Bilal, it's 65 million people, and we all have different narratives, different stories. We've come from different places. We have different cultures. We have different dialects. And so, yes, I found myself in the middle of this book saying, what am I doing? Will I ever finish? And my publisher kept saying, no, you have to leave your job and finish this, which I did do, and somehow got it out before the election, which is what was hoped.
Well, I mean, on that note, I mean, I think I remember a couple of years ago when you first told me about this book, you know, it was, obviously there's a news dimension to the Latino question that has been in our culture for the last few years. And as you said, the election was coming up, and there was a peg, as they say in publishing and in journalism, a question that many people are curious: what is this community? Who's coming across the border? What's going to happen with this community? Are they assimilating? Are they not? I mean, these are sort of the pressing. And when you told me, I remember you asked me, like, what is, when I say the term Latino to you, what does it mean? And I remember thinking that, you know, it's a kind of quite a wide assortment of things, but for me, even embarrassingly, nothing that connected into one coherent whole. And I guess I was curious, when you thought about sort of like the peg for the book and the moment that we're in, and you have the subtitle, The Least Understood. Was that on your mind as you're working on this book? Because especially in the last 5 to 10 years, you can argue, since 2016 especially, the idea of the sort of threat from the Latino community, it's been framed in a particular way.
Right. Yeah, the reason why we're most misunderstood, and now largest minority, least understood because we're invisible in many ways, and it seems like people are always asking us, who are you? I mean, where did you come from and who are you? And we're describing ourselves all the time. Invisible because even though we are now 20% of the population and will be by 2030, 30% of the population, we're the fastest reproducing portion of the American population. We're misunderstood because it's as if we've just come across the border yesterday, whereas we have been here since before the Pilgrims arrived. Many of us lived in lands that go all the way up from what is now the border to Colorado, and all the way from California to Kansas was once Mexico. So, there's that invisibility and that sort of neglect. There's also the fact that they're only, even though we're pushing on to a quarter of the population in this country can trace Latino heritage, there are only 1% of people on the boards of large corporations, or any corporations really of any note in this country, are Latino. Only 8% of the media, is Latino. So we're left out, and and then we're sort of vilified in Hollywood. The notion that we are always the villains, that we're always the murderers, that we're always the dark swarthies who are making trouble, when in fact the contributions in history of the Latinos in this country go all the way back to before the American Revolution. And I'm talking about historical figures, cultural figures, that many people don't even realize were Hispanics and Latinos. And in science, inventions, Nobel Prize winners, people who have actually pushed science ahead, and yet people seem to think that we've just arrived. So that least understood part of it. But there's so many ways in which we've just not been noticed, and it seems like just almost in this election, people have said, well, who are you and how will you vote, and are you really a unified group? And that has really been interesting to me, because that's exactly what I'm talking about in this book.
I want to get into more of the ways in which you approach the book and the research that you did for it, but on that note, you did write, you said an essay for the New York Times, and the book was published earlier this year, about this kind of Latino vote question that's been around. There's of course the undocumented immigrants that people talk about all the time, and deporting them, but then there's also the citizens who are eligible to vote,
right,
who are a huge portion of this country, in this community that you're describing. What did you want to say? Because I think one thing you write in the book is that the Democratic Party, for example, which has been seen as a party that somehow is more multicultural maybe, or has reflected more of the diversity philosophy perhaps, also takes this community for granted. It's something that you wrote, and so can you talk a little bit about what you were thinking about in terms of this vote question?
Yeah, I think it's the Democratic Party has really sort of rested on its haunches in thinking that we are in a way natural Democrats. And it is true to some degree. The Latino population has voted Democratic very, very solidly in past years, but it has moved, it has evolved, it has changed. There are very real reasons why it has changed. And I think that evolution has hardly been noticed by the media and by the population, and it's almost a surprise thing. When you think the fastest growing segment of small businesses in this country has been by Latino millennials. 73% of the small business industry is actually the movement, the motion is by Latino, the Latino owners. And they grow at a rate that is 44 times more. It's 44% rate of growth, which is 10 times more than any other segment in this, or any non-Hispanic. So you've got this small business group. You've got the GDP of this, if you were to consider the Latinos a nation, this 65 million community of Latinos, if you were to consider them a nation, it would have the 5th largest GDP in the world. That's the annual, $4 trillion that it is spending in this country is an extraordinary economic contribution. So when suddenly the Hispanics are voting for the economy, whereas the Democrats have thought that they will vote, of course, for identity politics, affirmative action, welfare. none of that is interesting to Latinos. Latinos really are very interested and obsessed with jobs, and they will take more than one if they get a chance to. So that has been a misperception on the part of Democrats, and it's been really interesting to watch because, even though this book was published in February, it came out really at the end of February and March, and that's very much what the book says. The party has been, the Democrat Party has been floating on this notion and not correcting its course, whereas it might have if it had really concentrated on the population.
Well, what interested me a lot about this section of the book too is that as somebody who also comes from an immigrant background to this country, I think that when you come to the US, you often do discover that there is, and especially I grew up in Virginia, that there is a kind of black-white binary, and the racial politics of this country, and the language, and even whether it's antagonism, whether it's inclusion, it's always framed around the black-white binary, as it were. And you write a lot about that in the book because part of the invisibility is that from a strictly superficial level, Latinos don't fit into the same racial binaries that we're used to. And it's bigger than the idea of they're brown, which is sometimes a term that people use as a kind of solidarity language. But I found that to be really important, and you come to it multiple times in this book. And I want to make sure also everyone is aware that there are numbers and such, but you really write a narrative history. And it's a book that really brings you in with stories and with personal stories. And so I wanted to ask if you could talk about that a little bit, because that's one of the ways I think whatever community you are that doesn't fit that typical understanding of race in this country, you are also invisible, partly because your visibility is just premised on a different set of ideas.
Right. And I think it's probably true for you too, Bilal, that you don't think of yourself as being, in the colors are much more nuanced in a way in the worlds that you and I have come from. There are more colors to begin with, and when you arrive in this country, and I remember very clearly arriving, just before I was 9 years old, and seeing in Miami, in the Miami bus station or train station, we flew in from Peru, and then we were going to take a bus elsewhere. And in the bus station, there were signs that said colored only, or whites only, colored over here. And I just remember thinking, what am I? And I was naturally assuming that I was colored. And my mother pulled me into the white thing, and I thought, okay, well, wow. And I didn't know what that meant. And it followed quickly thereupon that there was this notion that you are, if you're one drop black, you're black, and this was so confusing to a child. And as I talked to the 237 people that I interviewed for this book, there were so many like experiences. People who didn't know that they were Afro-Latinos until they got here. I mean, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans who get here and for the first time they're told, well, you're black, and suddenly, you need to be in the black fraternity or whatever. And they're surprised by that because they haven't been. They might have been light-skinned if they were in Puerto Rico, but they were considered black here. And that notion of being confronted with the binary is such a shock for so many of us.
Well, and I think when you mentioned that a lot of your work in the past was about Latin America itself and where people came from, and you bring a lot of that into this book too, is that many of the countries that a lot of these communities are coming from, their racial histories are very different also. And you do this with Argentina in the book, you do this with Mexico, where many of these countries, what perhaps we would identify in one way does not apply. The geography is different, the colonial history is different. And I mean, you include that throughout because it's part of the reason that when people come here, like maybe you did with those signs, you don't quite know which one you should choose. And that for a large number of Latinos in America, they didn't even necessarily, they identified just as white and that rendered them invisible too in our racial conversation.
Right.
Is that sort of the right kind of
Absolutely, absolutely. The thing that you said first, which was
about kind of including histories of Latin American countries.
Right. And this is such a big concept, Bilal. Thank you for bringing that up, because Latin America was all under, except for Brazil, which was ruled by the Portuguese, and the Portuguese king and queen actually went and lived in Brazil, which would have been unthinkable in the Spanish world. But basically, all of it ruled by Spain. And why is it so different? And why have we gone to war against each other? Because Spain ruled in a very crafty way of not letting us communicate with each other. The viceroyalties, the generalities, all of them were kept very strictly apart. You could not travel between them. You could not trade between them. You could not even grow your own olive tree if you wanted to. Everything was so controlled and kept very separate, so that each part was reporting directly to Madrid, like the spokes of a wheel. So what happened is that we didn't know each other, and we didn't collaborate, we didn't socialize, we didn't really know each other. This is really an interesting aspect of what happens to Latinos when they come to this country, because for the first time they're called Hispanics, they're called Latinos, and they don't, a Puerto Rican will not know a Mexican, will not really feel anything in common with a Mexican. A Cuban will certainly not feel anything in common with a Dominican, even though they're both Caribbean people. And it is all because in the historical framework, they were kept apart. And so you realize when you come to this country that you do have things in common. The Spanish colonial world actually did have a hold on you in the same way. And you were brought up in, even though you might have evolved to a different variety of person, you still, there are commonalities. Let's not forget that when 12 million Africans were abducted and shackled and sent across the Atlantic on rat-infested boats, there were the 12 million of them, only 350,000 of them came to this country. All the rest went to Latin America and the Caribbean. So you have, we have a tremendous infusion of African blood in our veins. And of course, from the very beginning, from the get-go, when the conquistadores arrived, there was intermarriage because they all were men. And so there was right away, there was a mestizo race, a race of people who were a combination of indigenous and Spanish. And then, of course, there was the wave of the Asians who came in to my country, to Peru. There was a wave of coolies who came in to work in the guano islands and who came to work in the mines as well. So there is a tremendous Asian infusion as well. So we have Asian, they call themselves Lasians, Latin American Asians. You have Afro-Latinos, we have Muslims, we have Jews, we have every variety, really, of these.
Well, and in the book, that's what I thought was incredible, was that you do have in this, the term sweeping was used a lot in the in the reviews of your book, a sweeping kind of history, but it has given, and you've sort of carefully written about all of these aspects. I think the thing that I was really moved by is that, again, you are narrating us and taking us through all of these stories, and you do write in the first person quite a bit. And one of the ways into these questions of intermarriage is that, like your memoir, American Chica, you write about your own family, your Anglo kind of Peruvian, your parents, and how you grew up in this sort of way with family members who had different relationships with their own Latinidad and not. And can you talk about, were you sort of sure that would be the right, did you always think that you would include something sort of this personal narrative through this, otherwise a big nonfiction narrative book about these very large concepts?
Yeah.
But I do think it's incredible how it grounds you and how it makes you understand why the writer is so passionate and perhaps so possessed with these questions.
Thank you for that. No, I didn't. When I first started and I wrote my proposal, to my editor, because he said, you're going to write this book, so write a proposal so we can sort of get a grip on what we're going to pay you. Which, I wrote a very nice proposal, and it was sort of very cold journalistic proposal of how I was going to approach this population and what I was going to cover. And then when I started, there was no way that I couldn't include myself. I felt at every level, in the political level, my mother was a Republican, my father was a Peruvian. She was an American, and there was the question of adaptation. My mother began as an immigrant to Peru, and the children were all really essentially Peruvians when we came here. But there was that sort of the immigrant part, the political part, the way that my mother persuaded my father at first to be Republican. That there was an evolution. They changed. She ended up voting for Obama, but that whole story, the whole personal story, began to have some relevance. And I felt, I can't do this. You can't. And my own grandfather, who had come to go to school at Notre Dame when he was 16 years old and had taken any number of boats to get up here, ended up crossing the border with Mexico to get into this country. So there was so much personal that was relevant to what I needed to describe. So I couldn't help but do it that way.
Yeah, I think it feels in a way a continuity of your memoir too, which, it's a different book, but I feel like that same sense that when you're reading your work, there is this family of themes. I also wanted to ask about your work at the Washington Post when you were editing Book World and reviewing books, and you have run this literary festival for a long time. The writing community. You've been an advocate for lots of different writers. When you talk about sort of and that includes many kinds of writers and of all backgrounds, people that you've advocated for. Do you feel that invisibility also when it comes to Latino representation in our literary culture, in the culture of the writing and the books that we're reading and the ideas? Because I have to say that it is, again, that community that everyone talks about, but how often do we actually hear the community speaking for itself?
Yeah.
And and I was curious for you in your work as a critic and as an editor, did you also feel that absence? Because you were obviously already doing that, and you were a person who people knew as being Peruvian-American in this world, but did you feel like you had a community of other writers?
That is such an interesting story, and it's so complicated, Bilal, because it starts so early. I remember going to university, and people would say, well, where were you born? And I would say, Peru. And I had a roommate who thought for my whole freshman year that I was from Beirut, because she heard Peru, Beirut, and so nobody was really interested in and nobody asked me another question, And then I started in book publishing in New York, and I would bring these ideas. I was editing Daniel Patrick Moynihan, I was editing Eugene McCarthy, I was editing Manuel Puig, who wrote, A Kiss of the Spider Woman. I was at all of these things. But every time I would bring something, a translation or a book by a Latino author, it was like, they don't read. Hispanics don't read. And it was almost like a slap in the face, because it was like, well, I'm here, I represent something. But it was always that. There's no market for it. I got to the Washington Post, and I have to really thank the Washington Post for really liberating this part of me, because I was not encouraged to use my Latino background. It was, but nobody asked me about it. I had become a real American editor. And then I got to the Washington Post, and I'll never forget the first day that I was at the Post, because I was down in the Human Resources Department. They were taking my information, and I had come from book publishing in New York to my job, in the book world, and eventually running the book section of the Washington Post. And the human resources person said, "Oh, you were born in Lima, Peru?" And I said, "Mm-hmm." And she said, "Well, does that mean you speak Spanish?" And I said, "Mm-hmm." And and suddenly it was, "Well, can I put you down as a minority hire?" And the next thing I knew, the executive editor was saying, "Oh, I see that you speak Spanish," and it was at a point when the sort of metropolitan area of Washington, D.C. was getting more and more Hispanic. And so he said, "Well, you know, would you be willing, apart from your book obligations, to go out in the field and interview some people and do some stories on this burgeoning population of Hispanics, but mainly whole villages of Mexico coming up to pick the tomatoes and work in the poultry factories." And so I did that on top of all the books things, but it made me realize that I was the only Hispanic. I was being asked to do this thing because I spoke Spanish, and it made me realize that there really wasn't much representing us. It has since changed. I think we have some marvelous Latino writers now who really, and don't even write about, you know, the coming to America experience. They're writing about being American and being Latino in America. And it's really wonderful to see that has growing. And it's growing in every sense. I mean, we have now Native Americans writing books, and we have a wonderful population of Muslim writers who are contributing to the literary world. So it's changing.
I mean, the thing, going back to the thing that you said about the kind of questions or the anxieties around the Latino community now, though, that were kind of in the air as you were working on this book. I mean, it does seem like one of the things that you do in the book is you trace different episodes in American history, including the fact that Richard Nixon was the one who really coined and started using the term Hispanic. Baptized you as a community, and that's a really interesting chapter I wasn't as aware of. But I would say that in the last 10, 15 years, as you said, the politics have been shifting. There's both the anxiety about the communities from Central America that maybe are coming as across the border. There's also, you know, the disparate communities of Latinos in this country, which is LA, which I have lived in the last few years, is a very distinct culture of Mexican-American culture and also indigenous California culture. You have Cubans in Florida, obviously, including, you know, politicians who are very big figures in the Republican Party who come from this community. And you have the Lin-Manuel Mirandas of Manhattan and sort of like the Dominican community there that he kind of, you know, musicalized in the Heights. So I think one of the things that you're doing in this book is you are writing this portrait of Latino land, and yet you also acknowledge that these things don't always necessarily connect.
Yeah.
And yet that is partly, and yet there is a unity to this country that exists within this country. And so could you talk about that tension? Because I do feel like that's part of the reason it's hard sometimes to answer a question like what is Latino in America, even for someone who isn't, because it is so many different things, and yet you have found a through line in this geography.
Yeah, it really is true. We are not monolithic. We are very, very different. And as I said, for the reasons that we were kept apart for so long and even made antagonistic toward one another. But I think, and there are some very different characteristics. I mean, even not only racial characteristics, but also cultural characteristics and historical characteristics in each portion, in each pocket. And now the pockets are actually blurring because you have Puerto Ricans going to Las Vegas, and you have Cubans going to Chicago, and you have Mexicans coming to New York. So that sort of neat little pockets that used to be is now, because the population is growing and it's actually changing culturally. But I think the thing that most struck me in trying to find unity, the unity is there, and why is it there with all of these disparate cultures? It's because of something like Nixon. Nixon actually decided at some point. He had a very low turnout of voters, Hispanic voters, in his first run. And so he was distressed by this. He said, "I'm Californian. My father was a grocer. I loaded trucks with shoulder to shoulder with Hispanic boys, and they were, I know them. I know these people. I lived with them. I've been out in the fields, trying to bring in the vegetables for my dad. Why didn't they vote for me? And so he actually created this campaign where he brought people into his White House and he asked them what is needed. And he was told, we need some generals, we need some bishops, we need some, and really concrete stuff. And he did it. He said, do it, do it, do it. And of course, when he ran for re-election, there was a considerable growth. But in order to get that re-election, he baptized Latinos, Hispanics, and he created Hispanic Heritage Day, which is now Hispanic Heritage Month. We can thank Nixon for that. So it was really interesting, that sort of realization. That was, of course, in the 70s, the early 70s. But I think what is truly interesting in this population is that eventually what happens is you realize that I may be Peruvian, I come from the Andes, I have really nothing to do with a Cuban or a Mexican or a Honduran, but by God, I could work, I know them in a sense, we work together, and you end up working together and being, culturally similar, even though you don't think you are when you get here. And it reminds me, and you mentioned this to me before we came on here, my biography of Simón Bolívar. Now, Simón Bolívar, who liberated 6 republics, I mean, he conducted this enormous revolution and for years and managed to liberate 6 republics all the way from the Caribbean, from Venezuela, all the way down to Bolivia, to the Andes. And he was always eager to really bring the whole Latin population in the continent of Latin America together. He said, I'm doing this because we all should be together. I mean, forget the Spanish concept of all of you being different. You're the same. You're all Catholics, you all speak Spanish, and you all, want to get on with being independent. So let's become, the United States of Latin America. And of course, the Latin America at that point was so feudal and so small-minded, and everybody, all these little territories that wanted power unto themselves, that it didn't work. He tried to put together a Pan-American Union. It died. It ended up as the OAS, the Organization of American States now, which tries to do the same work. But by God, there is a Bolivarian kind of unity that he always wanted there is created here. And the Latinos who are brought together, they're called the same name, Hispanic, Latino, check that box. And we have become this nation, in a way, that he always wanted us to be.
You said that millennial Latinos are the fastest growing kind of community of making businesses. I wanted to ask you about younger people that you interviewed for this book. And when you do look forward from your generation to, say, the current generation of people who are maybe in their 40s and 30s or 50s even, to younger people that you met, how do you feel like this country or this nation is evolving, or where do you see it going? And in a way, do you feel like, because I think one thing that I find really interesting is there's a lot more bilingualism that people are very proud of now. I feel like for a long time the model was that, assimilation was that you lost, you were losing the past. And increasingly, I think something that also makes a lot of people uncomfortable is that immigrants are feeling that they are in no way, lesser Americans if they are retaining more of their links to where they came from, or even practices. And I feel like, I was curious to ask you if you felt like you sense some of that among younger Latinos, the kind of solidarities that they're forging that are different from the past, as they're Americans moving into the future.
Yeah, it depends. This is part of the pocket thing, because the people, those who retain the language most among us are the Puerto Ricans. And it's ironic because they're Americans. I mean, this is American territory. But they're the ones who are most stubborn. We are stubborn in general about the language. We like to keep it. But there is such a thing as cultural attrition. And that means that my grandchildren don't speak Spanish. they're now operationally 100% American, and that happens too. If you happen to live in, I should also mention that Latinos are most likely to marry across ethnic lines. So Latinos will marry whites, blacks, Asians indiscriminately, because I think because we naturally have we are a mixed race. We are the product of an extraordinary experiment, really, which was to mix those races in the beginning, the European race and the indigenous race, and then all the other races that came to bear. There are very few of us, and we know where they are. They're Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, which actually imported whites. I mean, once they killed the indigenous off in those areas, they began to import white Europeans to their countries, very purposely, and treated them very well. In fact, the Argentines, who were, say, born in the 20s and were invited to Argentina, they came off the boat with jobs. They came off the boats with housing. They were treated very well. They were brought in, and so those countries have become an almost different race than the original mixed race that we were in Latin America. But we are largely mixed race, and I think that the beauty of science discovering the DNA of us, people are surprised. They may think that they're one thing, and I think this goes for the greater population. They may think that they're absolutely 100% white, and I have friends in Venezuela who have gone and described themselves as 100% Spanish blood, and it turns out that they're more than 50% indigenous, or they have a good 30% of African blood, or they may be Sephardic Jewish, and they have not known these things before. So it's an interesting experiment, the American Latino.
Before we kind of open up to the questions, I did want to ask you about sort of when you set out on this project. I mean, and now the book came out in February, and you've had it in the world now for a lot of this year. What have you been most struck by in the conversations that it's created, or perhaps what you've found in terms of? I feel like you are inviting and you want conversations. I mean, I'm not saying that just because I've had the privilege to have conversations with you, but I mean in general, you're the kind of writer who I feel really inspired by, because you want people to engage with your work and to set off on new conversations because of it. I was curious if you felt like that for you with this book, what sort of form that took, and what have you been most excited or inspired by as it's been out in the world as a book?
I think what has inspired me most is the fact that the things that are in this book are not taught in schoolrooms, and by that I mean the really important part that Latinos have played in the history of this country. And people, I think, are not aware. Certainly, I found, as in writing this book, that people are not aware that Galveston, Texas, for instance, was named after Bernardo Galvez, who was Bernardo Galvez was the governor of Louisiana and Florida when George Washington was trying to rally his troops for the revolution in this country. And there was a blockade on the East Coast, and Bernardo Galvez, the governor, created this whole army of people from the Caribbean, people from Mexico, people, all kinds of Latino Hispanics, to come up the Mississippi River to deliver ammunition to George Washington. George Washington then said, "I could not have done this without Bernardo Galvez. I could not have done this without him sailing his ships with a Spanish flag and bringing ammunition and troops and food to the Patriot troops." Where do you find that in a school book in the United States of America? You don't. Nobody is saying, "Oh, Bernardo Galvez." Basically, in the school books, it goes, Christopher Columbus discovered America, and then George Washington had the revolution. I mean, there's so much in between. And people don't know that, the American Revolution was actually fought with this Hispanic infusion. And then the Civil War. David Farragut, who was the first admiral in this country, the first admiral of the United States Navy, was a Hispanic. His father, who fought in the Revolutionary War in this country, was from the Balearic Islands, and David Farragut was the very guy who, there's his statue on Farragut Square in Washington, D.C., there's his bust in the Army-Navy Club. He is the guy who said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," and nobody knows that he's Hispanic. You will not find anything that says on any statue, there are many statues of David Farragut in this country, you will not find anything that says that he was a Latino. Or that Stephen Vincent Benet, who was the top ordnance officer in the Civil War, was a Hispanic. Or, that Mario Molina, who discovered the ozone layer and won the Nobel Prize for it, was a Hispanic. All of these things that, so these are the things that excite me and make me very passionate about people really learning this. Imagine Latino kids understanding that their history goes way back. They're very much Americans. They've contributed a lot. And that's the part that excites me.
Well, I want to make sure that everyone has, some people who have questions are also able to get you to speak with you. We have a few minutes. Yeah, please, here on the side.
I really appreciate what you're saying about recognizing people that have not been recognized in the past. I need to know if you've focused on Latinas.
Could you speak into the microphone, please?
Wow. Sorry. I appreciate that you're trying to make Latinos feel part of the culture. I work in an industry where I speak Spanish at work. I work with almost all Spanish-speaking people. I'm wondering if anywhere in your book you have focused on Latinas. I feel that women of all races, our history has been completely erased in this country. And I'm wondering, as a Latina woman, what are you doing for women?
There is, we are, the reason that you raise a really good question. We are a very matriarchal culture. There's no question about it. The most important person in my family was my grandmother. And she ruled the roost. And there are great stories of Latinas in this book. When I talk about the Latinos contributing to history, Latinas were getting dressed in Civil War uniforms. Fortunately, those Civil War uniforms were very baggy, so that women could get away with it. Fortunately, the Civil War actually was drafting so many young boys that a woman with no beard could perfectly pass herself off as a boy and fought in the Civil War. There are lots of stories like that. In Latino history. I use, the big thing. Are you going to use Latinx? Are you going to use, to what extent? Are you going to call yourself Hispanic or Latino or Latinx or Latine, as we're now doing? To me, Spanish is a gendered language. Right, it's a gendered language. It's just like Russian or Japanese or whatever. Nobody's trying to put an X or worry about the gender of other languages. But for some reason, that has become a big focus on Latinos. So I use Latino, Latina, completely fluidly. But there is a very, very strong narrative to be told about the Latina woman. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, there's a question here.
Hi. I read your book on Simón Bolívar, and it was wonderful, especially you're talking about the hub and spoke model of control that Spain did. My question is really about the role of colorism and about how even, and going back to Bolívar and the early colonial outposts that Spain had, colorism was used against each other, and where you think that fits in the American narrative as it relates to politics?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's a very strong and long history of colorism in Latin America, of course, and it's very nuanced in a way, because if you look at the Spanish colonial grids, when they came, they wanted to keep the Spanish white. It was an impossible thing to do. But when they started bringing the women over and then saying, okay, you only can be part of the government if you are Spanish born. So if you are criollo, what they call criollo, which is somebody who was 100% Spanish blood from a Spanish mother who then was brought over, that child would become a criollo. Then there were hierarchies established of what jobs you could have. If you were a criollo, when you could never govern, you could never be a priest. Only the people from Spain who came could have those choice jobs. And of course, then began the grid work, which if you look at old colonial grids of races, they actually very mathematically, this was the combination of an indigenous and a black in Latin America. This was a combination of an indigenous and an Asian. And this was, if you had, some Spanish, then it would become like this. And there was a whole grid with the pictures painted. And when you brought a baby to the church to register the baby, the priest would look and put down, okay, he looks a little Indian, I'm going to put down Indio. And it was very colorist from the get-go. But at the same time, there was also all this racial mixing going on. Because eventually, and this is crazy, but the Spanish had what they call cédula de gracias, I think it was called. And cédula de gracias was actually, and can you imagine this in the American context? You could buy whiteness. So the church got so worried about its finances because Spain was actually making all of this money with the gold and the silver and whatever, but then sort of wasting it randomly. And so the church got in trouble, it needed money, and so it said, we're going to have cédulas de gracias in which you can contribute your money and get a special certificate that says you're white. And all of this sort of mixing up that was going on when the Westward Ho movement, for instance, where all the Americans were going and putting their stakes in the ground saying, this is ours, when it was actually Mexican. It was an invasion of sorts, an incursion for sure. And when they went to war over this land, and the Americans won, and that was the Mexican-American War. And then Mexico, in signing the treaty, said, well, okay, the Mexicans who are on that land, all the way up to Colorado and all the way to Kansas and California, can stay in the land that they've owned for generations. They can stay. And the basic thing that we're going to insist on in this treaty is that you consider them white. And you're going to consider them white because blacks can't vote in your country. And we want these people we're leaving behind to be able to vote. So the Mexicans became white. And so there was this strange thing where, actually Hispanics were not even counted because they were putting white, because Mexico had won this for them. So the whole business of colorism has always been a subject, particularly here in this country, where it has become even more magnified in a way than it ever was. Thank you for the question.
In yesterday's election, Donald Trump increased greatly, by reports, his support in the Latino community. Yeah. Did that surprise you? Did you expect that? And can you explain it?
Thank you. Thank you. I explained it in the book, and my publisher was so eager for me to get this book out before the election, and which is why I did it in a hurry, and why it came out in February. And the book actually treats in a very concrete way the fact that Latinos are leaving the Democratic Party and going to the Republican side, and why. For many, many reasons. There has been a huge wave of evangelicalism in the Latino population. I mean, there are, you know, you have any Guatemalan who comes up. Guatemala is now majority Pentecostal. And you're likely here, if you're Latino-American, you're likely to have somebody evangelical in your family. It's, you know, a given. By now, the move to Protestantism has been huge. And that has a lot of reasons to it. Some of them very historical, and some of them very immediate. The Pentecostal church, I mean, one person I write about is Samuel Rodriguez, who is an incredibly engaging pastor who actually runs 64,000 Pentecostal churches, evangelical churches in this country. And he has been an advisor to George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Trump, somebody who has been able to negotiate the different political parties very easily, and that his whole flock is these incredible newly born evangelicals who are Latinos. So that, and of course the evangelical church says very concretely, vote your faith, vote your faith. And the evangelical faith is very definitely on the conservative side and largely Republican. So that move has gone sort of untraced. Also because, you know, very, very definitely, as I said, if you are part of a population of this 65 million strong population whose most pressing concern is jobs, and that incredible small business community, and that extraordinary nation that has now if you were to consider Latinos a nation, the 5th largest GDP in the world. The economy is huge, whereas, you know, the Democrats have been talking about diversity and affirmative action and welfare and all of that sort of thing. The Republicans have been going in a huge wave, door to door, and talking about the economy, and talking about putting food on the table, and talking about getting your kids into a uniform so that they can attend that school. And it has been an amazing effort on the part of the Republican Party to recruit Hispanics who have a big hole in representation in the electorate, because there are in any place, any town in Texas, you better believe that there is not a corresponding number of people voting as there is the number of population in any town. I mean, the registration rates are still so low that those towns become opportunities for the Republicans. The Republicans have been much more active in recruiting it, fed by money from the Koch brothers, from any number of places that have been devoted specifically to recruiting these people. And they've been very successful with Latino men. Who are, you know,
I think Latino women still, in the numbers from yesterday, more like larger numbers of Latinas voted for the Democratic Party than
yes.
There is a gender
yes, there's
divide.
a big gender gap. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you for that question.
I think we have time for one last question. Yeah,
it's a beautiful discussion. You touched on some of this with your discussion of the genetics as well, but I wonder, we've created Latino. Is that not just a trifurcation from that beautiful story of you arriving when it was colored or white? I mean, is it really appropriate to call a large, diverse culture Latino? And I think a lot of us use it differently. Like, I think of Latin America actually historically as South America, but don't actually typically think of Latin America as being Central America. And Hispanic to me is speaking Spanish, and not Luso-Hispanic, which would include Portuguese speakers, but Portuguese are Latin. And to me, Portuguese are more Latin than Mexicans are Latin, And having trained in northern Manhattan, I think of Dominicans as completely different than Puerto Ricans. And Dominicans live on the upper, in the Heights. Puerto Ricans live in East Harlem. It's a completely different culture. And do we need to? Is this helpful because it, characterizes a group and gives it power in numbers, or are we diminishing it by lumping again this tremendous diversity?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. I start the book by saying that we are a people of no name, and it's really true. We've never given ourselves a name. Everyone else has given us a name. It started with the Latino, the Latin part of it was actually given to us by Napoleon. I mean, when he had an eye on Mexico and he had an eye on Louisiana, and he was wanting to put the French in this hemisphere, and he said, you're Latins just like us. And the media has actually grabbed the term Latino. So it is by now just by media use the word that is most used for us. But and Hispanics, as I say, it is a misnomer because it assumes that you're 100% Spanish-blooded, from Spain, and that certainly isn't the truth about us. And then the Portuguese, right? Who are where do they fit in this whole thing? So it is a misnomer. All the way around.
Are Brazilians Hispanics?
Brazilians are not Hispanic, but they are Latinos. Yeah, exactly. Right. And and they're counted that way actually. So it's an interesting sort of confusion. But there's very little. There's actually very little. I would say communication between. If you go to the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, which is, a tremendously successful contributing arm that sits in Washington, D.C. If you go to Unidos, they're not necessarily bringing the Brazilians in, and that's a huge population. That's a huge representation, although not so much here in this country. The Brazilian, if you look at the grid of all the different nationalities that the Latinos are made of, Brazilians are way at the bottom. Their population, they're obviously not leaving their country in the same way that the people from the Northern Triangle or everywhere else are coming.
Well, we're out of time, unfortunately, but thank you, Marie, so much for being here and for this incredible book.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bilal, for moderating that wonderful conversation, and thank you, Maria Arana, for joining us here today, and thank you for this personal, narrative-driven work, challenging monolithic views of the people with no name, and thereby documenting and bringing stories to life that you mentioned are not taught in schools. And I think, thank you also for recentering, recapturing, and recasting these narratives of people past and present. I think it serves as a reminder to us all that we can challenge our assumptions about people and endeavour always to dive a little bit deeper to understand the people around us and the decisions they make. So Marie, I encourage you all to buy this wonderful book and read it. There are signed copies available of Latinoland, but also all of Marie's other books at our Books and Books official bookseller bookstore. Before we break out, I'd also just like to take a moment to say that the conversations that we have at Charleston Literary Festival are possible thanks to the imagination and generosity and vision of our sponsors. So I'd like to take a moment to just thank the sponsors of this event, Anne and Ken Tidwell. Are they here? Are they here? Thank you. And one more time, Maria Arana and Bilal Qureshi. Thank you so much.